So let's talk about shoulder impingement for a minute. Now, with shoulder impingement, it's kind of like a gross, all-encompassing term that is kind of just thrown at the shoulder for being a problem, right, and causing impingement. Well, the thing is, in a normal, healthy shoulder, there's always going to be a level of impingement that naturally occurs. The problem lies and comes when there's excessive amounts of impingement. So what we want to do is ultimately avoid that excessive amount as much as possible. We want to limit that. And what we want to do by limiting that is really start addressing the most common things that we see with people that have that excessive impingement. And when it comes to the shoulder girdle complex, we can really separate it into a couple of areas. First we want to take a look at the scapula or the shoulder blade. And then we want to look at the glenohumeral joint or your shoulder, if you will. Now, the reason we always want to look at the scapula first, or the shoulder blade first, is the shoulder blade dictates the movement and position of the shoulder, right? So what I mean by that is if you're in a slouch position, right, then some muscles are going to be tighter than others. If you're already in a position where your arms are up like this, your shoulder blade is going to naturally already be in a different position than what is called normal, right? And when we have a place of where we're starting away from normal, then we already have some muscles that are either going to be used prematurely or they're going to be already in a shortened position, making them not as apt to working at their full potential when we need them later on. So first, let's address the most common things with the shoulder blade. Naturally, if we're looking from behind, your shoulder blade should be sitting right on your back, right? And they should not be straight down, right, that inside border, but they should be at around a 7-degree angle right here, right? Just a little bit. Okay, now first and foremost, right, what happens, this is the back. First and foremost, it needs to come up against the ribs, right, and come up a little bit closer, then it wraps around. Right, now the thing is, our bodies, right, aren't two-dimensional, right? So it's not just going straight out. It's going to wrap around the ribs. And here's where things get really challenging. The rib angle is going to be different person to person. If you're somebody who spends a lot more time hunched over like this, then you're going to have a greater rib angle than somebody who's a lot more erect. So if you're somebody who has a greater rib angle, then that second component of that abduction, it needs to be that much stronger to really wrap all the way around the ribs. Now, so first, protraction, second, abduction, and then third is going to be upward rotation. Now, that upward rotation is what is going to allow the shoulder to be placed in the optimal position when you raise your arm overhead, right? The whole role of the shoulder blade is to put the socket in the wanted position that we need so the arm has a base, right? That's the entire point of the shoulder blade. So it's only, behooves us to recognize that when people have a limitation here, it's typically because the muscles controlling the shoulder blade really aren't doing their jobs that well. So if we focus 80% of our effort there, then really we can avoid this from the get-go, and if we're treating it, that's ultimately typically where we're starting and addressing most of the time. So, you have first protraction, 2 abduction, 3 upward rotation, and then 4 we have what's called a posterior tilt. So if I'm looking from the side here, we naturally have an amount of kyphosis, right, where we're hunched over. Well, when you raise your arm overhead, you're in more of the upper part of that kyphosis. So what we need to do is keep from going here, and we need to do what's called a posterior tilt, meaning it drops backward. That way we're not impinging, right? If we're here, we're gonna get some pinching up here, which is why we want to get that posterior tilt. So from here to here, and see how it just comes back, that gives us a lot more room in order to raise our arm fully overhead. So if we address just those 4 things, right, just from the shoulder blade, then 80% of the time, all of the issues are going to be just completely wiped away, right? And we're going to be able to limit from ever occurring in the first place. It's when we have one of those limitations, right, that we keep pushing through or keep causing more of that impingement, maybe because it doesn't hurt or it's not a hurt enough factor to really address it, that's where those little movements and compound, issues become bigger issues, right? Now, that's only one piece of the puzzle. Another piece is when you can have movement or excessive or limited movement at the glenohumeral joint, or the shoulder, if you will. Now, this really, the shoulder, in my opinion, it's so fascinating because it's very complex. Now, when you raise your arm overhead like this, raise it out to the side, raise it out in front of you, overhead, doesn't really matter. When you're raising your arm, you have a strong muscle here. It's called the deltoid, right? And the deltoid has a front muscle, one on the side, and then one in the back. Regardless of which angle you raise, that deltoid is going to pull that arm up, right? Imagine this is my humerus here. This is the socket. So its whole job is to raise it here, okay? So it raises it up. The trick is, or the cool thing is, the rotator cuff, which is a collection of 4 muscles, counter that raise by drawing it down. So what's really cool is technically the deltoid just raises it straight up. It doesn't actually raise it in this nice arc. What happens is the rotator cuff keeps it nice and seated, right? And then the deltoid raises it up, and as it gets above 90 degrees here, when it comes down, or when it raises just above it, the rotator cuff is actually now pulling it downward to counterbalance this, which is really cool because we need that, right? We have this socket where the arm is moving inside of it, and that rotator cuff's job is to kind of maintain it in the center as much as possible, right? Where the deltoid, if the deltoid is significantly stronger than the rotator cuff, what's happening is it's just going to keep migrating forward and ultimately leading to that impingement. Now, impingement typically is going to occur about 110, 120-ish degrees here, right? Before people start really feeling it. Now, you might be able to go a little bit further, but ultimately it's going to be limited here, because in order to get that remaining part of that motion from essentially about 150 all the way up to 180 degrees, you need to have the rotator cuff to be able to ultimately pull the arm down. So if the issue is not, at the end of the day, from the shoulder blade, then we want to start looking at the glenohumeral joint or the shoulder itself. And so from the shoulder itself, we kind of got to look at those 1 or 2 areas, right? And ultimately, when it comes to the body, we always want to look at the weakest link first, right? Or what tends to be the weakest link, because typically that's where injuries occur, right? It's wherever our most limitation is going to be, or the weakest link. So in this case, it's almost always the rotator cuff, right? Simply because the deltoid's significantly stronger, and the rotator cuff fatigues out. It's not as trained as well, probably because it's not as easy to see, where you really can't see it at all. So I think sometimes people neglect it until it's problematic. So what we want to do is look to see, is the issue really coming from the shoulder blade itself and a limitation of one of those 4 steps, right? Protraction, abduction, upward rotation, and then posterior tilt. Or if we can clear all of that away, then we can start looking at the glenohumeral joint or the shoulder itself and see where those limitations really occur. Honestly, at the end of the day, this is really going to encompass 90% of all shoulder impingement, shoulder impingement that I've ever seen. And I think it's going to really encompass everything that I'm ever going to see, because it's just that common, right? It's that common to have limitations. And what's really unique is you're likely to have an asymmetrical movement from right to left. And what's really cool is, like anything with the body, we can really train it to move that much better, to get stronger, focus on those limitations, and ultimately, typically this will lead to eliminating that pain and getting you back to the things that you love. So, if you found this video helpful, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next video.